Hi, everyone. I am Michaela Rio. I'm the development coordinator at the GLBT Historical Society. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to start by acknowledging that the GLBT Historical Society is based on Ohlone land. I invite any Indigenous folks with us today to make themselves visible in the chat if they so choose and be recognized as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous peoples. This event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel and our website. If you're watching live, we welcome you to participate in the chat and encourage you to post comments, observations, and questions for our participants. Before I turn it over to today's host, I would like to tell you a little bit more about the society and the work that we do. Founded in 1985, the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender Historical Society is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to promote and support the understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. Our operations are centered around two sites: the GLBT Historical Society Museum, located in the heart of San Francisco's Castro neighborhood since 2011, and the Dr. John P. DiCecco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market District. Please check out our growing array of exhibitions, events, and archival resources online at glbthistory.org. Finally, I want to thank all of our members and donors who make our work possible. If you are not already a card-carrying member of the GLBT Historical Society, I invite you to consider joining today. Members get a variety of perks, including 20% discounts on purchases of cool swag in our online store and access to special member-only events. You can learn more about how to become a member of the GLBT Historical Society and other ways to support us by visiting glbthistory.org/join-give. And as we get into the show, I would like to welcome you to Archiving Lesbian Memory, Stewarding Lesbian Futures, and introduce our panelists. First up, we have Jack King, who is an urban and digital cultural geographer and environmental psychologist. He is assistant professor of geography at the University of Kentucky. Jack's first monograph, A Queer New York, Geographies of Lesbians, Dykes, and Queers, 1983 to 2008, NYU Press 2020, is a historical geography of contemporary lesbian queer society and economies in New York City. As part of their commitment to public queer history, Jack created a companion website, including interactive maps of over 3,000 lesbian and queer places and organizations gathered from archival sources. An Everyday Queer New York website. He is currently conducting research on trans people's use of Tumblr as a site for cultural production and a hub of co-produced health and medical knowledge. Jack is managing editor of Acme International Journal of Critical Geography, the only fully open access journal of geography, as well as a board member of the Rainbow Heritage Network. Thank you so much for being here, Jack.
Thank you.
Next, we have Cait McKinney, who is assistant professor of communications at Simon Fraser University, the author of Information Activism, A Queer History of Lesbian Media Technologies from Duke 2020, and co-editor of Inside Killjoy's Kastle, Dykey Ghosts, Feminist Monsters, and Other Lesbian Hauntings, UBC 2019. McKinney is interested in how queer social movements use digital technologies to build alternative information infrastructures. Their current research is on activist responses to early online content regulations, the intertwined histories of AIDS activism and digital technologies, and the way sexuality has been used to explain data and databases since the mid-20th century. Brianna Simone Jones is a doctoral candidate in the Department of English at Michigan State University. She is a Black lesbian feminist of Jamaican and African American descent from Rochester, New York, and the editor of Mouths of Rain, an anthology of Black lesbian thought, published by the New Press and described as a groundbreaking collection tracing the history of intellectual thought by Black lesbian writers in the tradition of the New Press's perennial seller, Words of Fire. And lastly, Shanta Smith-Cruz is an archivist at the Lesbian Herstory Archives, an assistant curator, and associate dean of teaching, learning, and engagement at the New York University Division of Libraries. She is a co-chair for the board of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies at the Graduate Center, CUNY, and chair of the Archives Committee. She is the 2020 recipient of the WGSS Award for Significant Achievement, sponsored by Duke University Press, administered by the Association of College and Research Libraries, ACRL, a division of the American Libraries Association, for her work archiving and exhibiting the Salsa Soul Sisters, the first lesbian of color organization in the country. Thank you all so much for being here, and now I hope everyone enjoys the panel.
Hi, everybody. Unmute. We are to unmute. How are you guys doing tonight? You ready to start?
Yeah. We are ready to start.
Okay, cool.
I was trying to get an audio clip in there, but I'm just gonna...
Sean's up first, by the way. We're gonna
go without the audio clip. Welcome to Lesbian Visibility Day, everyone. I just learned that it was Lesbian Visibility Day when I read the description to this panel, so I'm excited. So I could go ahead and start if that would be appropriate. And then I guess I will figure out my audio clip. Maybe we'll do it, maybe we won't, because I haven't. I know what I'll do. One moment, please. While I'm just going to type it in and put audio clip, and then I will create a little link to it using Dropbox, because that's how we do. All right, so I'm going to share my screen so that we can get started. And let's see if I do this correctly. It's going to give us ourselves for one moment. Don't be frightened. Do we see my screen share? You have to tell me audibly because I can't see you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Looks good.
All right, and I'm going to time myself. And here we go. So I'm here to tell you the incredible, true, and untold storytelling of New York City Black lesbians in the archive for Lesbian Visibility Day, because we've learned that that is today. And I usually start, I wanted to start with this picture as a landing picture because it is me inside of a black box theater. It's an image that I use that holds a memory for me as in a collectively run theater space in New York City. Back in my nostalgic 20s for over 10 years, it was when I hosted a cabaret show for queer women of color called Rivers of Honey, and it was held at the historic Wow Cafe Theater. And in this particular show, I brought materials from Keepin' On, an exhibition from the Lesbian Herstory Archives. It's an exhibition on Black lesbians, and I added them to the wall. So you see there's like a half split image and then two others of posters on the side wall. And this traveling exhibit is of images of Black lesbian pioneers and iconic writers, librarians, artists, and activists and community members. And in this space, the fact that it lined the walls as I was performing a story at the center of a ceremoniously laid bed of rice. And I recited a poem, or rather, it was a poem, where I relived the fact that my Garifuna grandmother would use rice on her stove, and that in fact her altar was her stove. It was during this intermission after this ceremonial storytelling ritual performance that women were invited to come to the stage and scan the walls and connect images to ancestor, desire to movement, authority to creativity, and ultimately engage us both, or all of us, as we witnessed ourselves and the history of our lives inside of a transformative space of community. And so Serena Dankwa and Tara Theory were behind me. It was Serena's birthday. And so I wanted just to bring this image to the story because what I found in the archive is a story. So I wanted to introduce my story through the archival story and just jump right into it. But before I do, I wanted to also do another acknowledgement to say that in that space, in that same theater space, which I'm going to talk about, before each ceremony, we did do a circle where we locked hands and we embraced each other. There was always an altar, and we called to our ancestors to embrace each other, ourselves, and our history and our lineage of the land that we were on, and always acknowledging the power in our embrace. And it was an intergenerational space. So you have Edwina Tyler in the corner in the white at the left side of the screen. And you really just had a creation of a spiritual, ancestral, connected space, as well as a space where we shared art and shared each other. And all of these images, most of these images that I'm going to show from Rivers of Honey are from Shirley C. Olafern, who documented the space, and all of these images are also located in the archive. So I wanted to bring us to two collections. One is the Salsa Soul Sisters archival collection, and also the Rivers of Honey archival collection, both of which are located at the Lesbian Herstory Archives. The Salsa Soul Sisters is coined as the first African ancestral lesbian organization as we know it in the country, and it was based in New York City. And Rivers of Honey, it was a woman of color performance space and cabaret who brought to a public audience women of color drummers, rock bands, songstresses, and also produced solely by lesbians of color, mostly Black lesbians. So I'm going to start with Rivers of Honey because it was and is built on the premise of ancestral connection. As I mentioned, we had an altar, the goddess of the rivers, Oshun, and our intention was to highlight women of color in their performance. It met 11 months out of the year for over 10 years. I think it started in 96 or 94. And the art of women of color was showcased and produced by queer women of color. So I'm actually going to pull out of this and do a little show and tell of images from Rivers. And at this point, if this is going to be shown and recorded, this is when we would clip this part to not show these images on YouTube. But I did want to show them for the purposes of this talk. So the producers identified as Black and our Latina, our Afro-Latina women, all but one identified as lesbian or queer, and over 500 performances exist in the archive and during its time there. And it was a house, the house was always reaching over capacity. Thousands of women of color entered the doors of Whale Cafe Theater, which was a collective theater space, as I mentioned. And at times, Rivers of Honey was about professing something to the community. It was a show that, the first show that I produced was with a lover in 2009, and we asked Stacey Ann Chin to present her then recently released memoir. And we had Maria Bauman, Cheney Sims. We had a sort of a lineup, if you will. And because of that lineup, the line went around 2nd Avenue. It's located on 4th Street between Bowery and 2nd Avenue. And the line sort of started at Bowery, went all the way around 2nd Avenue. And we actually had to turn away over 100 people. And what was really magical about that night for me, of course, it was one of many, was that we were able to sit in rows of 4 on the floor inside of this theater. And while Stacey Ann was recalling her time back in Jamaica, where she was experiencing bouts of sexual trauma, she started to scream, "It was not my fault. It was not my fault," over and over again, and heaving in the silence, the thickness of the silence, then became howling. And then that howling became tears, and people were essentially leaning into each other and holding each other and caught in our throats. And I think that that night really did encapsulate to me what Rivers of Honey had been in this monthly event. So the archive that exists for Rivers of Honey is an archive of hundreds of women, mostly of whom are lesbians. There goes Dread, rest in peace, Dread. Thank you for coming. Who walked into this theater and graced the stage and touched the altar and found community there. Because the archive is currently housed at the Lesbian Herstory Archives, it holds large-scale posters, digitally recorded oral herstories, programs, videos of performance, digital photographs, letters, and essay. And it's open to continue to receive materials, but yeah, I consider it incomplete. The tension that lives in the gathering of these rich stories rubs against what I see as the mortality of the body and the potentially harrowing experience of reliving difficult past. So what I want to contend with on this day of lesbian visibility is the persistence of a lesbian identity that has in the past 10 years been put at odds with queer existence. When identities are put at odds within a queer umbrella, I want us to consider what conversations we need to have with each other and ourselves that keep us wanting to venture into spaces that are designated for those of us who choose to identify with that space and with each other. So I'm gonna pull out of the slideshow to go back into the slide deck. And I wanted to play a clip from one of our, one person who had produced the show. There it goes, Ashley Brockington. Let's see if it works with my Dropbox link. Founders and artists were not interested in recalling the over 10-year history because of the hurt feelings of the community that took place 3 years prior to the group's choice to disband. In short, there was controversy. These issues were what I like to consider an overlay of whiteness. And if I may take this interlude, as a member of the information science community and as a fiction major, storytelling like mine falls true to one of the 5 core tenets of a theory that has emerged in many scholarly entanglements, and that is that of critical race theory. And a background of this theory shows us that racism is ordinary and not aberrational, that interest convergence or society has little incentive to eradicate it, that it includes intersectionality, the overlap of race and gender, sexual orientation, ability, and et cetera, that we have differential racialization, or that race is not fixed to a genetic code, but that it is constructed, and that storytelling is pivotal to the experiential knowledge that centers the experiences of people of color. And so if we consider critical race theory, which comes out of critical legal studies, and how it argues that the law was not objective or apolitical, but that scholarship that ignores race is not demonstrating neutrality, but it's adhering to the existence of a racial hierarchy, then I believe that we can apply this to lesbian visibility. We cannot be visible without a body politic. That political resonance cannot exist without an examination for how race plays a role in our identity, our history, and our archival practice. So through this critical framework, I acknowledge that in the lived and archival experiences of lesbian identity, I beg us to consider the conversation of trans inclusion into gendered spaces that are focused on the bodies of queer women of color, on Black lesbians. What is the result of these social actions, if not closure and erasure, shame, fear, and retaliation? What does it mean to insert a dialectic on a community of bodies that was created to engage with our ancestors, answering questions of the spiritual? What is the racism at play when questions that have shackled women of color who have never once ever in this post-colony been recipients of power due to their bodied selves? Lesbians of color have never, ever been gender conformant. Whose narrative is this that is the visible narrative? And so when women of color labor has to answer to whiteness, what happens when whiteness permeates our spaces, fuels social media organizing, and then affects the work of real people in real time? The archive is not without borders, without implications of race, without ancestral connection. And yet when the ancestors beg us to hush, how are we able to tell our stories if we're unable to move past the fear? I have to look back to the history to answer these questions. And so within the Lesbian Herstory archives, I was able to find the Salsa Soul sisters, whose archival stories are not distilled or clean. They do not leave only white rice grains free of the sediment of the earth. They're not only bleached. It is to write our own stories that places us in an interruption to our mortality. And usually at this part of the talk, I go into the litany of survival and the fact that we're not meant to survive. But instead, I want to introduce Salsa Soul sisters to say that they were started in the early 1970s, I believe 1974, but I think Cassandra recently told me 1972, as the first known lesbian of color organization in the country. And I know that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to say that part of what happened in my introduction to Salsa Soul while I was doing Rivers was learning the history of Salsa Soul sisters as one that is equally as challenging and dispute as that of Rivers of Honey. At Salsa Soul, the women sat in circles. They talked for weeks and weeks about the state of being a Black lesbian. They formalized dances, retreats, teach-ins. They had discussions in groups. They participated in citywide marches, and they had a membership structure that was very similar. Their platform asked us to acknowledge that they functioned in order to respond to the economic differences that exist in the group and to see diversity as enriching their experiences and contributing to the emotional, intellectual growth of the organization. Their original collection was put in the Lesbian History Archives in the 1980s by one of the coordinators, Georgia Brooks. Georgia Brooks put in a small collection that detailed, very similar to Ashley's protestations, the fear, the challenges, the destruction that was happening within the group. 30 years later, Cassandra Grant came back to the Salsa Soul Sisters, came back to the Lesbian History Archives, and brought in a new iteration of the collection in 2016. And with that collection, that fuller collection, we do have a fuller story. We were able to exhibit the stories of these women, acknowledge how their stories began, and see where they have held their history within the New York City landscape. From that collection, we've had multiple exhibitions. We've had exhibitions in many places throughout the city. We've made zines. The First Lady of New York, the mayor's wife, Shirley McCrae, who was a Salsa Soul Sister, sitting in that picture, or standing in that picture on the right, as I'm staring up at her. And this is to say that the goal here, I think, with the Salsa Soul collection and with the archive, the exhibition of their archive, is to have us unbreak the mold of perpetual silence of Black lesbians that comes from not lack of doing the work, but an inability to recognize our space making and to document our space making into the archive. So I'm really looking forward to a conversation where we can talk about this conversation of lesbian visibility, as well as the conversation of lesbian erasure. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it to Jack.
Thank you, Sean. That was utterly amazing. So thank you for sharing that history. I am allowing sleep window screen. There we go. Okay. So make sure it starts on the same slide. So everybody seeing me too in my slides yet? Someone give me an audio yet?
You and your slides are up.
Yes, thank you everyone. Okay, so to start off where this is coming from, I recently wrote a book called A Queer New York, Geographies of Lesbians, Dykes, and Queers. And what I was really interested in the book is what is the lesbian queer function to capital as it relates to the city. So kind of how lesbians and queers, as how my participants identified, were gentrified and played a role in gentrification, and how they produce spaces otherwise. All of my participants talked about the idea of the gayborhood. When I asked 47 self-identified lesbians and queers who came out from 83 to 08, I wanted to understand, how do we get from AIDS to the L word in 25 years? They talked about how the gayborhood didn't work, and instead they talked about this idea of constellations, or the way they talked about producing spaces was that these spaces were more fragmented. They were really spread out. It wasn't just the clusters of Greenwich Village and the Lower East Side that solved everything for them. Far from it. That those spaces are very much racist, classist, ableist, and also that lesbian queer spaces with less political and economic capital last so much less longer, right? So like stars in the sky, they kind of like go out, but the memory of them, places like Crazy Nannies, Meow Mix, Papaya Bookstore, The Rising, every food co-op you have forgotten in the city, animal shelters, softball, rugby, you name it. Obviously, Wow Theater Cafe. Salsa Soul meetings is something that still sticks with us and shines on us, even though it doesn't still remain physically in the city. And I came with this idea of constellations where like stars in the sky come and go. It's the lines that lesbians and queers take between them to make space in the city. And I finished the book, and I had also spent a year doing archival research at the Lesbian Herstory Archives, which Sean just talked about, and just thought I'd include a shout out to the fabulous and adorable Deb Adel, who co-founded the archives. And this is the kind of the main room of the Lesbian Herstory Archives. There's there's baby me. That's what you look like before you do research, and just one cabinet of organizational records that I looked at. So for me, using the archive, I'm someone who is pretty anal, just really type A. I love a structure. And there are, actually, Sean, I'm sure can tell us off the top of their heads, but how many different kinds of collections there are, but there's button collections, t-shirt collections. And I really was looking for materials where they talked about a specific space and a time that people met. I wanted to understand the geography of where lesbians and queers went, or the barriers. And so actually what you're looking at is 392 organizational records, which I think is the complete collection of New York City-based lesbian queer organizations from the records. I think that the Lesbian History Archives actually has the largest LGBTQ organizational collection in the world that I've found so far. And really much in thanks to Maxine Wolf.
Sorry to interrupt really quick, Jack. Would you mind putting your slides as full screen?
Oh yeah, you can't see.
We're getting.
Oh yeah, there's baby. Okay, there we go. Yeah, totally. I didn't know. It said that it was. Yeah. Okay, great. So
unfortunately, it still looks like we're seeing the your screen with the presentation and all of the slide deck.
Okay. How about that? How about now?
I think that's a little bit. Yes, perfect.
We're good? Okay, groovy.
I will fade back into the background once more.
Great. Okay, awesome. Thanks so much. Sorry about that, everyone. What I was seeing looked like the same. Okay. So anyway, so these are the kind of the materials that I typed up, and any kind of white note actually has text typed into it. And as I was gathering these materials, I was really just trying to make sense of lesbian queer experience in the city. There was no lesbian history of New York City, and to kind of make sense of what my participants were sharing with me and to really ground their stories, I really had to dig deeply into the archives and understand the minutia. One of my participants talked about, when I was evicted, she had come out in 1984, and people in these multi-generational focus groups that I interviewed everyone, they also made mental maps of spaces and places important to them. They brought artifacts important to them when they were coming out. One of my participants said, when I got evicted and these people came out in the 90s and the 2000s, said, well, why'd you get evicted? And this woman who came out in 84 said, well, because I was gay. And the women who came out, these were specifically women, they were also trans and gender nonconforming people in my research. That group was all women. Were just shocked and embarrassed that they didn't know that history, right? But how would you know that in 1987 that law changed in New York City, right? How would you imagine that without these resources and access to lesbian queer history, which has always been hidden from us, obscured, deleted, erased, and it's taken a lot of effort for people to maintain it and claim it and to keep it and to tend to it. And so while I was typing all these materials, I was also typing a lot of addresses. And that was, how do I go to the, yeah, okay, great. Hopefully you can see it now and go to the addresses. So here is a shot of a series of, and I'm just going to make sure you can all see that. You can all see a bunch of different maps on the website. And on the screen. And there are actually very few queer public interactive history maps, actually. This is about half of them that exist that I know of in the world. It's kind of crazy. And
Jack, unfortunately, sorry, we're still seeing the same screen. Okay. There we go.
There we go. There we go. Hot dog. Okay. So, yes. Okay. So I practiced this before, and yeah, of course it's not working because I must have picked the wrong drop down. But as you're seeing these various kind of maps, there's probably queering the map is something you're the most familiar with, which is just this great, amazing map where you can add any story and any dot, and there's no record of time or the kind of person or identity that's attached to it. It's just like, this is where I had my first kiss, or somebody looked at me and I knew I was gay, or there was a great orgy here, sort of thing. But most of these maps actually take place in New York, like the NYC Historic Sites, Addresses Project, Outgoing, and the Addresses Project is really fantastic. and finally Outgoing, which maps all of New York City light life. When I was thinking about all the material I gathered, I also gathered many, many addresses, and there's about 800 addresses in the material I gathered. And I was trying to make sense of like, what do I do with this? Should I map it? Is this a good thing to do? And all that material, for those of you who are data nerds, only comes to 789 kilobytes. That's like a floppy disk and a half. So a year's worth of typing and so much important history takes up a very small amount of space, but it has a large impact. Then I decided to map this information. And I built this website, An Everyday Queer New York, looking at the maps and teaching tools. And this is the first map that I made. And I'm going to kind of stop sharing and pop back in, since it's not letting me do what I want to share. Screen share. Yes, just let me share on the screen. Yep, select one the screen. Entire screen. Here we go. Yes, hot dog. So you're going to see this map. So this is actually strikingly and bizarrely the first map of everything ACT UP ever did, and Lesbian Avengers, and Queer Nation. And this is weird because these organizations, so many organizations, Salsa Soul is on here, WOW is on here, and you can run your mouse over and see all these things, and this information is public. And I'll be adding census layers. I've been working with the really wonderful Rich Donahue, where I work at the University of Kentucky, who's helped me really make all these maps 10 bazillion times more interactive than I could, because this is, really high level coding to like get this kind of work out to the public. But you would be able to also see which groups were specifically identified themselves as feminist, and groups that also did immigration. You can check out AIDS, etc. You can see which groups happened when, and then click through and also see this Queer Nation event and what happened specifically. But to go back to our slides, I also created this gorgeous map, and this is a map I want to talk about what's worth recording. How do we make sense of lesbian queer history? What is it? What's worth recording? There's a very famous paper called Queering the Map, where Larry Brown and Michael Knopp invited dozens of LGBTQ identified people in Seattle to sit down and make a map of queer history. Now you can imagine that this was a cluster, right? Because these were people from a wide range of ages, coming out at very different moments and experiences, different races, different classes, different genders, different sexualities, and trying to decide what made or didn't make the map was an incredibly contentious experience. And what is a queer space is something that a lot of people debate. Some people find it very easy to describe, but most people find it very difficult. For example, a space like mapping down is a kind of idea of taking these places that we know are of the people, from the people, and one space is Identity House. If you're unfamiliar with them, they're a peer counseling drop-in group since 1974. And they, of course, appear very happily right in the center of the map, kind of gorgeously. And isn't that great? Maybe you can see this now. Great, there it goes. But there's also mapping up, because as I was putting this data together, I was working with a research assistant, a young student undergrad, who helped me type all these addresses in this other map. And so while there's 800, something like 890 some addresses on the organization's maps, there's something like 1,712, forget, on this map, which is every address listed in publications. And so this is kind of a weird thing to think about, but where did lesbians go, and where did they shop, and where did they hang out, and where did they do activism, and where did they drink, and where did they have events? And so publications can tell us a lot of materials. And so looking through 25 years of them brought me so many spaces, but that includes something like Identity House, you just saw. It also includes something like Bed Bath & Beyond. And you would say that's kind of banal, but there's also, when we think about Bed Bath & Beyond, it also relates to something like U-hauling, right? So we are also being targeted, and there's also these ties to commodification and corporatization that are part of LGBTQ history as well. And also when the joke of what is a lesbian taking a second date, a U-haul, there are there's another way to read that, as I write about in the book, and that's that there are so few spaces for lesbians and queers, and being able to feel safe and to make a safe space with someone else is really important. And also, with less political and economic power, being able to afford a space and to feel queer and safe in your life and your body is incredibly important. And so all those moves require more stuff, right? And so there's a targeting of our people. And that's something also to contend with. And so what goes on these maps of LGBTQ history, and where do we get this data, and what data is available to us, right? Like something like, if you think about what Sean just talked about, Rivers of Honey, how do you map that? How do you tell a story about that? How do you represent it? And something you wouldn't put online because or you might, but in a very limited way, about who wants to be online, who wants to share their stories, what's safe to share. There's something that I'm really interested in is in the future, how we think about, and I'll go back to the map so you can see it, how we share our future. Here's this one. Top of that, there's Big Apple Ranch or something. But you can also kind of see patterns in this map. For those of you who are familiar, you can totally see the 7 train. You can see different subway networks. You can see different patterns over time and over years. The years go by, and then there's the politics of how do we add other memories? How does this data get corrected? Because maybe what's in the archives is missing a lot of materials. Like, people haven't donated their materials and don't see that as important to lesbian queer history, and I don't have those addresses, and people might want to share them. But also dealing with trolls, like Queering the Map was shut down by a bunch of Trump trolls. How do you take in that information? How do you store it and maintain it for the future? And how do we envision lesbian, queer, trans futures, who are trans people who are very much clearly on the map, including me, and how do we make them possible by looking back at our past? And I think, if anything, this specific map does that you're looking at, it looks like rainbow confetti just fell all over New York City. And I think that's really empowering to see how many spaces and places that lesbians and queers made. But there's also, a contention about the data and how we make sense of ourselves. So those are some ideas I wanted to share about lesbian queer archives and lesbian queer futures. So that's it.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all again for having me. Similarly to the land agreements that were stated before, I want to take a moment to recognize my presence on the territories of the Anishinaabe peoples, and to bear witness to the long legacies of survivance and resistance of the indigenous peoples of the First Nations. My work could not be possible without a meditation on the impacts of settler colonialism, indigenous resistance, and the legacies of what M. Jacqui Alexander calls crossings, or rather our continually overlapping histories of dispossession. And so I want to thank my fellow panelists and the GLBT Historical Society for sharing space or creating space for me to share my work. So I'll share my screen in just a moment. I'm waiting for the document to load. All right, are you all able to see my screen?
You are up, but we are just seeing the, you might want to put it into present mode.
All right. Can you see that?
You're all good.
All right, cool. So this cover photo is by a South African visual artist, Zanele Muholi. But yeah, so before I get into some more interesting things, I guess, about Mouths of Rain or my own archival research, a lot of my work has really been shaped by Black feminist thought, not just my work, but the ethics, or rather the way that I live my life. And so really briefly, my academic introduction to Black feminism was, in sort of an academic sort of standpoint, was through the work of the Combahee River Collective, as well as the early work that Beverly Gashefdaw did with her first book, Gender Talk, as well as the widely read or widely sold anthology Words of Fire, but also Hortense Spillers. And so in the winter of 2019, Hortense Spillers made really poignant remarks about Black feminism, as well as its praxis and the particular ethics around Black feminism. And so in this particular interview with Brandeis, one of the things that Spillers stated that I think really sort of aligns with, the way that I move through the world is, quote, "What Black feminisms might teach the current social order begins with concernful care for other human beings." And so when I think of archiving Black lesbian life, I think that in so many ways, there is this investment in care for the actual lives of Black people, of Black queer folks, and most specifically Black lesbians. And my screen should read something that Spillers stated that I think is really important. And Spillers writes, "I should like to think that Black feminisms as a repertoire of concepts, practices, and alignments is progressive and an outlook, and dedicated to the view that sustainable life systems must be available to everyone. It also stands up for the survival of this planet, which pits itself against the kleptocratic darkness that now engulfs us. If we're going to reach a different place," and as she mentions, it's difficult these days to be hopeful, Black feminist ideas and ideals might be one of the lights leading us there. And so I think in similar ways, Black lesbian ideas and ideals might be one of the leading lights that moves us, I think, past the notion of visibility, but really thinking about the conditions that make visibility possible, and perhaps thinking of visibility coupled with protection, or coupled with actual tangible resources that make life sort of actually sustainable. So I'll move really quickly into the archive in Mouths of Rain. So Mouths of Rain, an anthology of Black lesbian thought, traces the long history of intellectual thought produced by Black lesbian writers spanning the 19th through the 21st century. And so in the anthology and in my work, I think of Black lesbian as a capacious signifier. Mouths of Rain includes writings by Black women who have shared intimate and loving relationships with other women, as well as Black women who see bonding as mutual, Black women who have self-identified as lesbian, Black women who have written about Black lesbians, and Black women who theorize about and see the word lesbian as a political descriptor that disrupts and critiques capitalism, heterosexism, and heteropatriarchy. And so the anthology takes its title, or borrows its title, from a poem by Audre Lorde, and addresses pervasive issues such as misogynoir and anti-Blackness, while also attending to love, romance, and coming out in the erotic. And so this is just a sort of snapshot of the first part of the anthology, which I titled Uses of the Erotic. And so in studying the genealogy of the Black lesbian radical tradition, through folks like Angelina Weld Grimke, Cheryl Clark, Dion Brand, Audre Lorde, Pat Parker, and more current folks like Alexis Pauline Gumbs, I located patterns in these writers' particular or respective epochs. And so the 5 parts of Mouths of Rain attempts to archive these historical, spatial, and embodied discourses so that as an audience, we might be able to learn from their varied and sometimes homogeneous languages. I believe Lorde when she said in Uses of the Erotic that there are no new ideas, there are only new ways of making them felt. And so Mouths of Rain as an anthology is building upon the work of Toni Cade Bambara's The Black Woman, which was published in 1970, as well as Words of Fire, and more similarly to the theme of Mouths of Rain, books like Aphrodite and Does Your Mama Know? Texts that I believe demonstrate how Black women have sought and still seek to set the record straight about their own conditions. And so Mouths of Rain traces the trajectories of liberation from self to community through Black lesbian thought. And for me, I thought, that Lorde's poetics of the erotic, how she insists that the erotic is praxis or something to be exercised, I really thought this essay needed to be archived again. And so in this particular prose piece, Audre Lorde writes, quote, in celebration of the erotic, my work becomes a conscious decision, a longed for bed which I enter gratefully and from which I rise up empowered, end quote. And so this mantra was a measure for me as I constructed the anthology. I wanted to map the genealogy of thinkers who aspired toward that kind of satisfaction and wholeness. And so in the love we make and in the work that we do, from the personal to the collective, the energy that we put towards achieving something, what does that actually look like? And so part 1 of Mouths of Rain attempts to add color, texture, flavor, and language to the uses of the erotic. And so a lot of my research, even outside of the anthology, was really guided by my time that I've spent through my graduate study in the archives of the 3 faces that you see. And so from my left to right, you'll see Angelina Weld Grimke, Alice Walker, and Audre Lorde. For the sake of time, though, I'm really going to sort of emphasize my engagement with Alice Walker's work, because I really think that when I think of, I guess, visibility as the ability to be seen or the investment in providing folks with an unobstructed view, I think of the work of Alice Walker and the poetry that I found in her archive that I think really helps fill in particular chasms about who she was as a writer and how we approach her work. And so I'm not sure if folks are familiar with the novel, The Color Purple, but it was published in 1982 and won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and a National Book Award in 1983. I'm going to show a clip from The Color Purple that features the relationship between Celie and Shug. All right, so hopefully you are able to tell sort of the intimacy that was shared between Celie and Shug. But so prior to conducting my archival research at Emory University in the summer of 2018, I read the novel Color Purple in undergrad. And the text, of course, is widely circulated or engaged, I would say, especially in sort of literature courses or AFAM courses in sort of the undergraduate experience. The relationship between Celie and Shug was always striking to me as an undergraduate student. And I always hoped that the discourses about their shared intimacy could be further explored. Walker publishes the novel in 1982, in 1983, she gives us this robust definition of womanism. And so if you look at sort of the second definition of womanism, Walker writes, a womanist is a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually. And so in this second part of the definition of womanism, Walker describes love between women as a site of possibility. And so to me, it was extremely important, as I returned to this text, to really think about the era or the time period that Walker was writing. And so I think in a lot of ways, what she was trying to sort of underscore in this relationship with Celie and Shug, as well as with the definition of womanism just a year later, are the various ways in which, women have the capacity to love each other, not only in platonic ways, but intimate ways as possible. And so the image above, or the image that you see, is actually the typescript, I guess, of Alice Walker's poem, Can It Be, which is included in Mouths of Rain. And I, I was very fortunate to be able to include this poem in my anthology. But I think what it makes particularly legible is Alice Walker's sort of sustained engagement with queerness. And so you have the construction of, Celie and Shug in the novel in 1982. And then in 1985, you have the film. And then, less than 10 years later, we have not the publication, but the actual ocular proof of Alice publishing the poem, Can It Be? And so side by side, I think that I wanted to show the audience, I guess, particular choices that I made as an editor. And so the poem actually is 3 pages long. This is the second page. And Alice actually drafted 2 different but very similar versions. And so in one version of the poem on my left, you have Alice Walker in this first full stanza stating, "Oh love, your body is as sacred to me as the earth, the black of it so secret, so sweet, and so mysterious, the brown of it so velvet and so lush." I chose to publish what you will see on the right, which reads, "Oh woman, your body is as sacred to me as the earth, the black of it so secret, so sweet, and so mysterious, the brown of it so velvet and so lush." And again, I think it was really important because oftentimes I think that there is sometimes when the color purple is discussed, from my purview of understanding, folks tend to excise the genuine love that sort of permeated the relationship between Shug and Celie. And I also think that we haven't necessarily been able to fully have a conversation about the queer resonances in Alice's work. And so I believe, with the publication of the novel, as well as with the production of the film in this poem right now, we're seeing perhaps a constellation, as Jack stated in their presentation. But I think in a lot of ways, a part of what I endeavored to do in constructing the anthology was making visible, or rather filling in these particular chasms in history or in discourses. And so I think, as it pertains to Black life, it's extremely important to add texture or to try in whatever way to show the full scope of what it means to have a Black experience. And I think in a lot of ways, the archive, even with all of its tensions, can sometimes provide fertile ground for these stories to not only be planted, but for them to actually bloom. And I think it was really important for me to include the poem by Walker to show, I would say, again, this sustained engagement with Black queerness. And so I am almost certain that I have reached my time, but during Q&A, I can definitely sort of answer more questions about, my choices and my archival experience.
thanks, Brianna. It was really cool seeing the manuscripts and more about idea and anthology. Hi everyone. Thanks for being here tonight, and thanks to my co-panelists for sharing this space.
Cait, unfortunately, you're having some audio difficulty.
Oh, one sec. Is that better?
Much better. There we go.
Okay. I was just saying, thanks, Brianna. It was really neat to see the choices that you made around working with manuscripts and archives as you were putting the anthology together, and to learn more about it. Yeah, so thanks to all three of the other panelists for sharing this space, and all of you for coming out tonight to watch, and to Lee and the Historical Society for hosting. I am on unceded Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. I live in Vancouver, and I am going to share my screen, which seems to be a bit complicated, but hopefully it'll work okay. It works, okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about a concept from my new book, which is called...
Sorry, Cait. It looks like we're still having a little bit of trouble with your microphone. There's a lot of crackling.
Okay, let me see what I can do. Is that any better?
It seems to have gone away. I think you're good.
Okay, just interrupt me if something goes off again.
Perfect.
Okay. Thanks, Lee. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about this concept from my book, Information Activism. And I'm going to try and connect it a little bit to what the other three folks, Brianna and Sean and Jack, have talked about too at the end. And so this is my cover of my book that came out recently. And in the book, what I argue is that lesbian feminists have a whole lot to tell us about information. And that's because they show us how groups who lack stable access to information that's useful and culturally meaningful treat making that information as activist work. And we've seen a bunch of examples of that already tonight. And what I argue in the book is that folks who are marginalized because of gender, race, and sexuality have the most to tell us about how, when, and also for whom information matters. So if we want to learn about technologies that provide access to information, we ought to be looking at the labor that these activists do. And when I use the term lesbian feminism, I'm talking about a diverse movement that folks often associate with the 1970s and 80s, but as we've also seen tonight, is actually ongoing in the present. And like Sean brought up, we can think of lesbian feminism as a precursor to queerness, but also as a part of queerness in queer politics. And that's because lesbian feminism tried to imagine other ways of living and being outside of what was conventional for women. So, for example, being a lesbian feminist meant envisioning a life that wasn't based in being married to a man. It wasn't organized around patriarchy and its social and economic structures. And lesbian feminists took up all kinds of issues. So many of these issues are shared with other radical feminists, issues like dismantling gender hierarchies, racial justice and working across difference, reproductive health, but also other issues like sexual expression, censorship, erotics, and also lesbian visibility within larger gay rights struggles. So to do this work, lesbian feminists use all kinds of media technologies, and I've put a bunch of them on the slide here. So technologies like newsletters, telephones, computers, bibliographies, indexes, pin buttons. And they use these technologies to create and share information to serve their communities. So their communities weren't being served by mainstream institutions like schools or the news media or public libraries. What I do in the book is I look at a bunch of different projects that I consider information activism. So projects like the Lesbian Periodicals Index, the Black Lesbian Bibliography, and the Lesbian Switchboard Telephone Hotline, and the digitization work that's being done at the Lesbian Herstory Archives, where Sean has worked for a really long time. And sometimes it can be hard to think about like why this work is necessary, because we're so removed from the moment of like a lack of technological access to information in our present moment. Like our lives are hyper mediated. So what I like to do is just ask folks to actually like try and put yourself there. So I want everyone to imagine for a minute that you're a young lesbian in 1983, and I picked that year because that's the year I was born. And this is like a really different time than the present. So homophobia is widespread. There's a complete lack of accessible information about queerness or representations of queerness in your world. You don't know any other gay people in your city, and maybe you aren't sure where to go to meet them. And you feel like you can't ask your friends or your coworkers. Maybe they're homophobic, or maybe they just wouldn't know. And there's no internet, right? Because it's 1983, so you can't just like look this up. But you're too nervous to do something like go to the public library to ask for books because you might bump into someone you know, or like your mom's friend works there. So what do? The information activists that I study were making resources to help this person. So for example, they made lesbian-focused telephone hotlines that women could call to ask their questions. And they tried to staff these hotlines with diverse groups of volunteers, so that if you were, for example, a woman of color, you could call and speak to somebody who had shared your experiences. Or if you were a lesbian living with a disability, you might be able to call on a particular night or speak with someone who shared that experience. They also made newsletters that you could subscribe to or buy at feminist bookstores. And they wrote bibliographies and made indexes and databases to organize all this information so it would be easier to find. And they also made their own archives to collect and also preserve all this information so that it wouldn't be lost for future generations, so that it continued to do something and live on, which is, I think, a theme we've also seen tonight. So for the activists I look at in my book, information builds worlds. Information holds together an organized movement, and it also makes life more livable for individual lesbians, like that young person looking for resources. And the information activists I look at in this book are women who were frustrated because they couldn't find information about lesbian life, and they responded to that frustration by making that information themselves. And when I use this term, information activism, I'm talking about a range of materials and processes that make up labor that's it's always collective, and it's often behind the scenes. It's often unglamorous, but it's what makes social movement work and community work happen. So with this concept of information activism, then I'm thinking about bringing together three things. The first is like people situated in their specific experiences of the world. Second, their visions of justice. And third, the media technologies that they choose and also use to organize, store, and provide access to information. And by looking at information activism, we can start to understand the role that different feminisms have played in histories of commonplace technologies. So in the book, I tell the history of a number of different technologies through lesbian feminism. Technologies like the telephone, the computer, and the database. These are some pencils that my partner had made for me to celebrate my book, but because of COVID, they've mostly sat in a drawer. I thought I would be able to hand them out to people, and one day I will. And they say it's a purple pencil that says lesbians invented the internet. And I'm putting it up there just to kind of conclude by saying that like one of the things I hope people take away from this book is that we need to shift away from ideas like invention and maybe even like complicate ideas like visibility, which several others have already raised. If we want to tell lesbian histories of the world and of technologies, like we need different methods and different frameworks. So this is like a joke. Of course, lesbians didn't invent the internet, but in the joke, I'm trying to like kind of take some of the power away from that concept of invention that we often go to when we think about technology and information. The last thing I want to do is just like connect up this concept information activism with the rest of the panel. So I think of the other three panelists and the work they're doing as information activist work. And Brianna's work is pretty new to me, but I've been diving into the anthology, and it's wonderful. And it's so clear from the way you talk about the work and also your introduction that it's care work and intergenerational work. Sean's work I've followed for a long time, and especially your work on the Salsa Soul archives is something that I've used a lot in my own research. And it's meaningful work, and it's work that changes what we can teach in classrooms. And it's also, as you've talked about it, ancestry work. So thinking across generations. And then Jack, your work has changed the way that I think about space when I think about queerness. In fact, it's like showed me to think about space because I'm not trained that way. And I so appreciate that in like what your work has given me. So just to say that I'm like so happy to be here with the three of you, and also to say that this information activist work isn't something in the past, it's ongoing. And I will wrap it up there. Thank you.
That was so beautiful. Thank you all, and for everything you said. We have a million things to say to one another, I'm sure. So there is a Q&A, so if anyone has a Q&A, drop a question in, and we'll get questions sent to us. But does anyone here have a question for one another? Or any comments you want to make? You should know that there's a private chat where we're just loving on one another and telling each other how amazing each presentation is, and kind of being swept up by the pencil and the book, and yeah.
And the poetry and the maps, and just, I didn't even know about I actually am just learning about your work, Cait, so I want to dive into your text and see more about how we have been communicating, because one question that I guess I do have that can come to all of us that I think is replicating, and the work that I'm seeing is about the networks, the lesbian network, and how we've been communicating, and what does a lesbian network look like, and how do we use it to move our work forward, but also to reach backwards and reclaim a past? I mean, what if we're thinking about how we've been communicating, how are we communicating now, and how do we sustain that kind of network, especially at a time like this when the world is so remote? Anybody can answer that question.
I don't have an answer to the question, but the question makes me think like so much of the work that folks showed tonight is like such high touch work. Like it's work that takes trust and relationship building and time. So those networks, like they don't just span generations, but they're like, they're deep and wide and built really solidly. And I don't know, I'd love to hear also reflections on that aspect of networks too.
Yeah, so like when Manuel Castells wrote this, like the first thing on gayborhood, this first major piece on gayborhoods in '83 about the Castro, he said, well, I don't actually know where the lesbians are. They really like networks and potlucks. And that was like, and he's like, that was it. That was like this major article, about gay and lesbian organizing. And so in kind of like how lesbians are discussed in literature is networks, these vague things. And I was like, but what does that mean in our lives? And so I think like the communication that like Cait played out in Information Activism, just such a beautiful book, and a nominee for the Lambda Literary Award. Just want to put that out there, y'all. Very good in LGBTQ studies. Like speaks to that, and like what Brianna's book is like generations of trust and like love and inspiration and listening. And Sean's work too, like God, the breakdowns and the breakups are just as important to record as like, all the love and the success and the activism, like what gets left off the map, what gets left off the story. How do we sustain that? Like those networks too.
I have a question for Brianna.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know about your process in getting I feel like that your process, in my head, I have the answer to your question, so I want to know if it's true. That the network is what led you to get.
You broke up a little.
Oh no. Can you hear me?
I'll type while you talk.
Oh, you can't hear me?
All right, I'm back.
We can hear you. I think we can hear Sean, but I think Brianna had some internet difficulty.
Can you all hear me now?
Oh, now we can hear you.
All right, cool. You said you wanted to know my process for what?
Yeah, so I wanted to know about how you got the permissions for all of the stuff that you got in that book. I mean, I'm assuming that the process was through networks, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Talk about what it was like to. I feel like you reached your arm deep to the elbow, to the shoulder cap, right? Like into the archive for rich texts that no one would get their hands on or could reprint. And then here they all are in a package. And I feel like the time that I thought it would take is older than you are. So how did you get it all done?
Yeah, so
swiftly and so seamlessly is what it seems like.
Yeah. So I think in a lot of ways, I'm really, really thankful for the work that a lot of Black lesbians did before, either my time on Earth or, prior to me even engaging this material. And so Cheryl Clark, I think, was instrumental in terms of getting me in contact with folks like Jewel Gomez. But in a lot of ways, I think that what this process really taught me about is vulnerability and asking, right? And so I think that whenever, I placed myself in a position to ask, it forced me to reckon with, a possible rejection. And the academy is full of rejections, right? So, it's not like I was a former basketball player, so I'm not like, not used to rejection, but, I had to actually email on Twitter. There were some people I found on Facebook or on Instagram. And so in a lot of ways, it was really just an ask. And I was fortunate that there was so many books that sort of preceded Mouths of Rain. And so a lot of our lesbian, elders or even folks who are currently writing saw the need for a book like this. And so really asking, I think like that is sort of the short answer, because even how I met Alice Walker, I walked up to her at the National Women's Studies Association conference. And my phone screen was cracked. And, I tried to show her Can It Be and told her like, hey, I found this poem. Please let me publish this. And so I'm thankful for spaces like that, like NWSA, where an Alice Walker would be in attendance. And Julie Enzer too, my publisher who, an editor who was really sort of instrumental and supportive of the project from early on. So a lot of it was, yes, asking. And I taught a lot of these works or texts before the anthology. So with the short time frame, I was happy that I had actually engaged the material and was already sort of mapping these constellations either in my own dissertation or in the classroom or, in conversations with folks in my community. So I hope that sort of answered the question.
Just a request that you publish that entire experience as a book. I'll write your proposal for whatever you need. I want to hear that story. I want to hear all the stories so badly.
Just running into Alice Walker.
Yeah, just tell with a broken screen. I just want to. Please. It's amazing.
I feel very fortunate.
Oh, so we got a question. Could any of you speak more about your experiences using informal, non-institutional archives in your research? Oh, can we? Who wants to go?
I feel like Cait hasn't talked a lot.
I can start us off. Like, I work mostly with community archives in my research because that's where activist archives tend to end up, especially like activist archives that are less kind of sexy for large institutions to acquire. So I have done a lot of research at the Lesbian Herstory Archives in New York, which Sean and Jack can speak more about, but also like community LGBT archives in California, in Canada, and increasingly like online collections are becoming more and more important to my work.
Cait has a great article on porn in the Lesbian Herstory Archive. There's a great article. We can share the link to that later. Yeah, but Sean is the real archivette, so I think Sean should talk. Actually, I really want to hear what Sean has to say.
I forgot the question. It was something about our relationship, but I can read it.
Non-institutional archives.
Thank you.
Informal, non-institutional.
Yeah, I mean, I work in a library that is an institution at NYU, and I used to work at CUNY, and I also work with CLAGS, which has its own archive, and we work with an archival repository, and I work with lots of digitization projects where we have to do the traditional work of processing to get archives in order. And in fact, that is all very helpful to my work with the Lesbian Herstory Archives, which is a community-based archive, not based in an institution, not accepting a government funds, completely community-run and volunteer organized. So it's like two opposite ends of the spectrum. And so when you want to access material in one location versus another, you just run into different kinds of problems and challenges. And you also get a different level of access to community archives than you do to institutional archives. Fun fact is that the Lesbian Herstory Archives got a $90,000 grant from the Mellon Foundation, which we were able to accept because it's not a government fund. And we're going to use that to do some digitization, do some online exhibitions. So we're digitizing some videos. We're doing an oral history project. So you'll hear about that in the coming year. And we're also going to put the Salsa Soul materials in an online exhibition, which is pretty exciting. That was just me doing a small plug. That had really nothing to do with answering the question, but I had to throw it in there. So we're working hard to create an online digitization, online database, really an online exhibit of the materials, those materials and others. Most of the things that were already chosen to be exhibited into the world. We want to further promote that. And it's Lesbian Visibility, so that's perfect connection to that. Jack, you're muted.
Oh, I was just saying that's amazing. And I can't wait to see it and teach with it. Oh, BM Watson. Thank you, everyone. This is really lovely. Question for anyone. Y'all have talked about labels and categories. How did people you study deal with the catalog? I.e. in the library and archive. Like a big reveal. That was a great question.
I can get started while other people are thinking about it, because I think it comes up in a pretty like obvious way in my work, which is one of the things I look at in the book is like a history of the kind of work that I think the questions from Bree, who I know is like doing a lot of this kind of contemporary work around catalogs and descriptive terms in queer and trans context. So I look at like the history of how lesbians have created their own cataloging systems when like standard systems failed them. But I also look at like the tensions that happen in those catalogs over time as like values within the community change. So how does a community group like rethink the terms that they're using to make their catalog, and how do they keep records of the old catalog as a kind of archive in and of itself? And like how do terms come out of community experience and get like debated within community before they're settled on? Those are all questions I look at in the book as like kind of really nitty gritty and maybe like a boring part of information activism, but super important.
I also wanted to acknowledge that I saw Lauren's question in the chat about whether or not I have a book to look out for. And the answer is yes, I do. Oh, there it goes. but it's not. But it has nothing to do with Black lesbian archives, which I know everybody's like, well, what do you have to talk about? I mean, what else is there? But it is a queer book. It's called Grabbing Tea, Queer Conversations in Librarianship. And we're having actually 2 sections of it, one of which is on archiving, generally speaking, and one of which is on librarianship and like coming out and identity and like gender at the reference desk. It's a library thing. But I will say that there is talk about putting the Salsa Soul Sisters into print. And so we have already done snippets of that with Julie Enzer, who is Brianna's publisher, also does Sinister Wisdom, a multicultural lesbian literary and art journal. And Sinister Wisdom just had its issue 118. It's already at issue 120 now. They're so fast. But 118 was focused on the Lesbian History Archive, which I co-edited. And that has a piece on salsa. There's a piece on salsa in Mouths of Rain, thanks to Brianna's grace. I'm in the same book, like reaching forward to Alice. I'm in the back, she's in the front. I'm like, hey, high five. And then there's also pieces in other Sinister Wisdom issues. And we're talking about putting a thing together. But I think, you know, right now we're working on getting the collection online. I think that's like the thick of it. And then a new project that I am working on, because I am trying to like transition from salsa, because I think it feels like it's almost contained, although that will never be true, is to working on the Rivers of Honey archive and putting that together. So I'm working with a Canadian librarian, Melissa Adler, who talks about cruising in the library, and she's doing a project that's sort of a creative organizational project where we're going to bring in the Rivers of Honey archive and do something that's not just scholarship in a traditional sense, because it can't live that way. So we're working on that. That was a reveal.
That's amazing, Sean.
Several.
See how it goes. Of course, I had to get people comfortable enough to like say that they were willing to share their stories, which has been the challenge.
Yeah. That's really cool. And so talking about like catalog and identities, I just to add to that, like a lot of my participants changed their identities very much so, and they continue to change their identities. And they had an average of 5 to 6 identity terms they each used, and they even changed them while they were talking to me. So people like other queer people made fun of me when I decided to do this work. Like, you're up a creek without a paddle. Like, and I was like, I'm just gonna do my best. And there's a whole method section at the back that says, I'm so sorry, I was just doing my best. Like, it's never gonna be what we, just trying to like make these words work for us. Just for my guess, my thing is like soon, hopefully this year, it's taking a lot of coding, but the constellations will each be mapped. So you'll be able to see each participant, every space that they mentioned individually, they'll have their own constellation and they'll have their quotes, and you'll be able to click on it. So you'll be able to see like Alex's story and Wanda's story and Desi's story, and you'll walk through New York City in their lives, and I'm hoping to put images in and stuff, and maybe even they might want to record their audio or ask other people to record audio, and just like to make them come alive, I think is like kind of, because it gets so abstracted in these bigger maps, and I really want to like honor their stories. And hopefully the software will be made in a way where you can just type in all your spaces and it makes your constellation. Like, that's the long-term dream, so you can record your own and add your own. But it's going to take a while because I don't do JavaScript, so one day at a time, as I say. So that's my future.
Well, I'm going to pop in here to say hello to everyone, and thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists for joining us tonight and for sharing all of your amazing, in-depth, and completely expansive projects. I'm going to close us out for the evening. I know that we can... Oh, Jack wants to say one last thing.
I want to thank you all. And I want to say, I have known Sean for 20 years next summer. We have run into each other on and off through our lives. And I hug you. And it is an honor to meet you, Brianna and Cait. Your work has totally changed my life too. I talk about it all the time. And it's just an honor to be in conversation with you. And I love you guys so much. And I appreciate everything you do. And it changes, like, it's just so beautiful. And so many people talk about it so often. So I just want to thank you and just express that love too.
Your love was so hard it knocked Brianna off the screen.
Yeah, I was like, oh no, where did Brianna go? There we go. The return of Brianna.
There you go.
Thank you so much, everyone. We wanted to put this together for the upcoming Lesbian Visibility Day later this month, and so I'm so glad that we've got the opportunity to have such a wonderful conversation. I'm going to close us out this evening because as much as we could, continue talking for forever and ever, it is very late for our wonderful panelists who are joining us from the East Coast. So thank you so much. I'm just going to close us out really quick with a reminder that folks can get all of the books that have been mentioned this evening, and then hopefully in the future we will get Sean's up there as well. But so we have a bookshop.org website or a affiliate link. So if you want to purchase any of these books, help out the panelists and their research, and support queer authors and researchers and scholars. And you can also kick a few cents to the GLBT Historical Society. It'll help us. And we also would love to remind everyone that for more of these sorts of events, if you'd like to attend these and others, you can become a member at glbthistory.org/memberships. And we'll also be looking into hopefully opening up the museum pretty soon, and you want to be able to visit as well. So I hope that everyone has a lovely evening and be safe, and we will see you for our next event. Good night.